It was a torrential downpour, the kind of freezing, unforgiving rain that washes the color out of the city. The glowing headlights of idling SUVs cut through the blue-tinted night, reflecting harshly off the slick pavement. In the center of the street sat a child. 7-year-old Lisa, her damp clothes clinging to her shivering, vulnerable frame. But it wasn't the biting cold that made her squeeze her eyes shut in terror. It was the dark, angry bruise blooming across her pale cheek. Beside her wasn't a panicked mother or a helpless bystander. Kneeling in the mud was a man in an impeccably tailored black suit, his slicked back hair soaked by the storm. King, a man whose entire Mafia empire was built on perfect, calculating detachment. A man who never raised his voice, never showed a crack in his armor, and supposedly cared for nothing but power. But as King gripped the small girl's shoulder, staring at the violent mark his enemy had left on her to send a message, that icy facade shattered. King threw his head back and let out a raw, unbridled roar of absolute fury that overpowered the thunder. The shadowy bodyguards surrounding them tightened their grips on their rifles, knowing what that sound meant. King wasn't going to send a message back. He was going to deliver a massacre. This is the story of how a ruthless crime lord burned his own perfectly ordered world to the ground, all to avenge the tears of his maid's daughter. Now, let us begin the story. The heavy oak doors of King's study didn't just open. They were an entry into a world made of cold marble and silent fear. Inside, King sat behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single piece of shadow. He was a man of logic, a leader who viewed the city like a chessboard where people were merely pieces to be moved or discarded. His reputation was his armor, a shield of ice that kept everyone at a distance. But every morning, that armor had a tiny, invisible crack. That crack was named Lisa. While King's guards stood like stone statues, the 6-year-old girl would often dart into his office, her bright laughter echoing against the bulletproof glass. She was the maid's daughter, a child who should have been invisible in a house of secrets. Yet King found himself secretly setting aside his most ruthless plans just to listen to her talk about her drawings. To the world, he was the king, but to her, he was just the tall man who made sure she always had the best colored pencils. The piece was shattered at exactly 11:15 p.m. King was reviewing a shipping manifest when a frantic scratching at the door stopped his heart. Elena, his loyal maid, collapsed into the room, her uniform torn and her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had been walking home with Lisa when a black car jumped the curb, blocking their path. Men in gray suits, Marcus's men, had stepped out. They didn't want money. They wanted to send a message to the man who thought he was untouchable. One of them had grabbed Elena, while another, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, had looked down at little Lisa. "Tell your boss the rules have changed," the man had sneered. Then, with a cruelty that had no place in business, he struck the child across the face, sending her small frame tumbling onto the wet concrete. They had left her there, bruised and sobbing in the gutter, as a warning that nothing King loved was safe. King didn't yell. He didn't flip his desk. Instead, he stood up slowly, his movements so precise they were terrifying. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. He grabbed his charcoal jacket, his eyes turning into shards of blue ice. Marcus had broken the one rule that kept the city from burning. He had targeted the innocent. As King stepped out into the pouring rain, his bodyguards fell into formation behind him like a wall of shadows. He saw the distant glow of headlights near the corner where it happened. His logic was gone, replaced by a dark, driving need for justice. Marcus thought he was starting a negotiation, but as King saw Lisa's small, shivering shape ahead, he knew he was starting a war. King reached the corner of 4th and Main just as the sky seemed to open up, drenching the world in a cold, heavy gray. The streetlights flickered, casting long, shaky shadows across the pavement. There, huddled under the rusted overhang of a closed shop, was the small figure he had been dreaming about in his nightmares. Lisa was curled into a ball, her tiny hands clutching her knees. Her wet hair was plastered to her forehead, and her shoulders shook with deep, silent sobs that were nearly drowned out by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. King didn't care about his expensive suit or the mud that splashed onto his trousers. He dropped to his knees in the middle of a puddle, the water soaking through his clothes instantly. When he saw her face clearly, his heart felt like it had been squeezed by a giant fist. A dark, angry purple bruise was rising on her delicate cheek, a mark of pure malice left by a grown man's hand. This wasn't a business mishap or a stray bullet from a turf war. This was a deliberate strike against the only piece of innocence left in his life. "Lisa," he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in 10 years. The girl flinched, her eyes snapping open in terror. For a split second, she didn't see the man who gave her colored pencils. She saw another shadow in a dark suit. But as King reached out, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and rage, she recognized the icy blue eyes that usually looked at her with hidden warmth. She let out a broken wail and threw herself into his chest, her small arms wrapping around his neck with a grip of desperation. King held her so tight it hurt. He buried his face in her wet hair, the scent of rain and cheap laundry soap filling his lungs. As he rocked her back and forth, a terrible realization washed over him. He had spent years building walls of concrete and iron, believing that his name alone was a shield that could protect everyone under his roof. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his power made him a god in this city. But he had been wrong. His reputation hadn't stopped the blow. His wealth hadn't kept the rain from freezing her bones. He pulled back just enough to look at the bruise again, his thumb grazing the edge of the swelling. Lisa winced, and the sound of her pain was the final spark in a powder keg. King's face transformed. The grief vanished, replaced by a cold, sharpened fury that made his bodyguards take a step back. He stood up, lifting Lisa effortlessly into his arms and shielding her from the wind with his jacket. He looked out into the dark city, seeing Marcus's territory in the distance. He had lived by the rules of the Underworld for a long time, but Marcus had just burned the rulebook. King wasn't a businessman anymore. He was a predator, and he wouldn't stop until there was nothing left of the man who made Lisa cry. The rain did not stop, and neither did King. He arrived at the gated entrance of Marcus's main warehouse, a place that moved millions of dollars every week and served as a key asset for the rival syndicate. His bodyguards, appearing as shadowy figures in the blue-toned night, waited for a command. But King did not give one. He stepped out of the SUV, his tailored black suit still soaked from kneeling in the mud to comfort Lisa. He walked straight toward the heavy steel doors with a look of raw, unbridled fury. Normally, King was a man of strategic patience and cold logic. He would have sent a negotiator or made a cold phone call to discuss a territory dispute. But the image of the dark, angry purple bruise on Lisa's cheek had burned away his usual diplomacy. When the guards at the entrance tried to block his path, King did not answer with words. He moved with terrifying efficiency, his movements precise and lethal. Within seconds, the way was clear, and he did not even break a stride. Inside, the warehouse was filled with Marcus's men. They looked up, expecting a message or a threat. What they found instead was a predator. King moved through the room like a ghost. He did not shout. He did not scream. He simply pointed, and his men began to dismantle everything Marcus owned. This was the relentless hunt he had promised himself when he found the girl crying in the rain. Crates were smashed and equipment was shattered. King walked to the center of the office where Marcus's lead manager sat shaking with fear. King did not ask for money or a deal. He simply took a heavy object from the desk and crushed the ledgers Marcus used to track his business. The silence King maintained was more terrifying than any threat he could have yelled. By the time King walked back out into the storm, the building was a hollow shell of smoke and broken glass. He stood on the wet pavement, his face twisted in a silent roar of vengeance that only the rain could hear. He had not said a single word the entire time. He didn't need to. Marcus had broken the rules by hitting the Maid's daughter, and King had replied by obliterating Marcus's empire piece by piece. His men watched him in the cold light of the SUV's high beams, realizing that their boss had finally traded his emotional detachment for a war that would not end until Marcus was gone. King arrived at the mansion, the scent of rain and smoke following him like a dark shadow. He went straight to Lisa's room, needing to see that she was safe after the hunt he had started against Marcus. But when he opened the door, the room felt cold. Lisa was huddled in her mother's arms, her eyes wide with a look King had never seen directed at him before. It was pure, unfiltered fear. "Lisa, it's okay," King said, stepping toward her. He tried to soften his voice, but it still carried the cold edge of a man used to absolute obedience. Lisa didn't reach for him. Instead, she flinched and pulled away, burying her face in Elena's shoulder. She saw the blood on his hands and the raw fury still simmering in his eyes. To her, he wasn't the kind man who gave her gifts anymore. He was part of the violence that had hurt her on the street. Suddenly, a massive explosion shook the floorboards, and the sound of breaking glass echoed from the front of the estate. Marcus was retaliating, showing King that his fortress was now a target. King's bodyguards scrambled into position, their heavy boots thumping on the marble as they worked to protect the house. Lisa screamed, a high-pitched sound of trauma that cut through the noise of the alarms. King reached out to comfort her, but she shrunk back into the corner of the bed, her eyes filled with terror. She wasn't just afraid of the man outside. She was terrified of the man standing in front of her. For the first time in his life, King's emotional detachment failed him. He had always believed that his power was a shield, but he realized now it was actually a wall that was pushing Lisa away. He stood in the center of the room, caught between the war raging outside and the breaking heart inside. He was the king of the city, but he was losing the only person who made him feel human. He had to conquer his own detachment if he wanted to be her protector instead of just another monster. The smoke from the explosion at the front of the mansion filled the hallways, tasting like burnt rubber and broken dreams. King moved through the haze like a shadow, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. He had just seen the fear in Lisa's eyes, and it hurt more than any bullet ever could. He needed to get Elena and Lisa to the safe room, a place where the walls were thick enough to forget the war outside. "Elena, take her hand," King commanded, his voice barely audible over the screaming alarms. But as the emergency lights flashed red, a sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. King turned back, expecting to see the mother and daughter huddled together. Instead, he saw only Lisa. She was standing by the bed, her small hands covering her mouth, her eyes fixed on the open balcony door. The heavy velvet curtains were flapping in the wind, and the rain was spraying into the room. Elena was gone. King sprinted to the balcony, his boots crunching on shattered glass. Down in the driveway, he saw the taillights of a black sedan racing away into the stormy night. A single piece of paper was pinned to the doorframe with a jagged knife. It was a message from Marcus, written in an ugly scrawl. "You took my warehouse. I took your heart. Let's see how much the Maid is worth to a king." King felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Marcus was a fool. He believed he had found a simple weakness, a servant to trade for a kingdom. He didn't realize that in this house, Elena wasn't just a maid, and Lisa wasn't just a child. They were the only reasons King had left to be a man instead of a monster. He looked back at Lisa. She was shivering, her face pale as a ghost. Without her mother, she looked smaller and more fragile than ever. The emotional detachment King had used as a shield for years finally crumbled into dust. He didn't care about his territory or his money anymore. Marcus had taken the woman who gave Lisa her world, and King was going to make sure Marcus regretted every second he spent breathing. He walked over to Lisa and knelt, not as a boss, but as a protector. He didn't look at his guards or his phone. He looked only at the little girl whose world had just been torn apart. "I'm going to bring her back," he whispered, his voice like grinding stones. "And I'm going to end this tonight." The war was no longer about messages or rules. It was about blood, and King was ready to drown the city in it. King didn't waste time with a chair or a light bulb in a dark room. He found Marcus's lieutenant, a man named Victor, in a cramped, oil-stained garage on the edge of the docks. Victor was still wearing a smirk when King's men shoved him against a cold brick wall. But that smirk died the moment he looked into King's eyes. There was no logic there anymore. There was only a storm. King didn't ask about Marcus's bank accounts or his shipments. He didn't give a speech about respect. He simply stepped into the man's personal space, his wet suit jacket steaming in the humid air of the garage. He held up the jagged knife Marcus had left at the mansion. "Where is she?" King asked. His voice was a low, dangerous growl that sounded like grinding metal. Victor tried to let out a dry laugh. "You think I'm going to talk? Marcus will kill me if—" Before the sentence could finish, King's hand moved like a flash of lightning. He didn't use the knife. He used his fist. The impact was loud and heavy, a dull thud that echoed off the metal rafters. Victor's head snapped back, his breath leaving him in a wheeze. King didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him back against the bricks so hard the mortar crumbled. "I am not Marcus," King whispered, his face inches from Victor's. "Marcus wants to rule you. I just want to find my family. And I am running out of patience." He pressed the edge of the knife against the man's sleeve, not to cut skin, but to show him how close he was to the edge. The cold steel was a promise. King's movements were fast and surgical. He wasn't hurting the man to be cruel. He was doing it because every second wasted was a second Lisa spent crying for her mother. Victor's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. He saw the shadowy figures of King's bodyguards waiting by the door, and then he looked back at King. He saw a man who had finally let the monster out of the cage. "The old foundry," Victor gasped, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear. "On the north side of the river. Marcus took her to the basement. He's waiting for you there." King didn't say thank you. He didn't even nod. He simply let go of the man's collar, letting him slump to the oily floor. He turned on his heel and walked toward the idling SUV, the rain already washing the dirt from his knuckles. "Secure him," King commanded his men. As the engine roared to life, King checked his watch. The hunt was over. The rescue had begun. The old foundry loomed over the river like a rusted giant, its jagged roof cutting into the storm. The SUVs pulled up, their tires screaming on the wet gravel. King didn't wait for a signal. He stepped out into the downpour, the cold water drenching his black suit as he stared at the heavy iron doors. This was Marcus's kingdom, a place of fire and metal, but tonight it was going to be his grave. With a sharp motion of his hand, King's men moved forward. The silence of the night was instantly shattered. Flash grenades exploded like tiny suns inside the lobby, filling the air with white light and thick, gray smoke. King was the first one through the door. He didn't hide behind his guards or stay in the back. He moved with a terrifying calm, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The action was fast and relentless. Marcus's men scrambled to find cover, their shouts lost in the roar of the rain and the rhythmic thud of King's advance. Sparks flew from the overhead machinery as bullets grazed the rusted beams. King didn't flinch. Every time an enemy appeared his path, he dealt with them with surgical precision. He wasn't just fighting a war. He was clearing a path to the only thing that mattered. They moved deeper into the foundry, passing through rooms filled with the smell of oil and old iron. The floor was slick with rain that leaked through the ceiling, making every step a gamble. King felt the vibration of the machinery under his boots, but his heart was beating even harder. He could almost hear Lisa's voice in the wind, a reminder of why he was here. He wasn't a businessman looking for a deal. He was a father figure looking for a child's peace. As they reached the heavy staircase leading to the basement, the resistance grew even more desperate. Marcus's elite guards tried to hold the line, throwing everything they had at King's team. But there was no stopping a man who had already decided he had nothing left to lose. King used the shadows to his advantage, moving like a ghost through the smoke. He was a force of nature, as unstoppable as the storm outside. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he stood before a single, reinforced steel door. The air down here was cold and smelled like damp earth. King gripped his weapon, his knuckles white. He could hear a faint sound from behind the metal, a woman's voice, muffled and terrified. His jaw tightened, and his icy blue eyes burned with a final, lethal spark. He didn't need to give an order. His men stacked up behind him, their shadows dancing on the brick walls. With one heavy kick, the door began to groan. The siege was almost over, and the final showdown was only a heartbeat away. The door crashed open with a sound like a thunderclap. Inside the basement, the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and rust. A single, naked light bulb swung from the ceiling, casting long, jittery shadows across the brick walls. In the center of the room, Marcus stood behind a chair where Elena was tied, his hand gripping a pistol. He looked tired and trapped, like an animal backed into a corner. "Stop right there, King," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "You really did it, didn't you? You brought an army for a servant? You're weak. You let a little girl and a maid turn you soft." King stepped into the light. His suit was ruined, his hair was a mess, and his face was spattered with rain and grime. He didn't look soft. He looked like the end of the world. He didn't say a word. He didn't tell Marcus how he had found him, and he didn't explain why he cared about the people in his house. He didn't need to. Marcus started to laugh, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Let's talk about a deal. I give her back, you give me the docks, and we call it even. Business is business, right?" King didn't stop walking. His boots made a heavy, steady sound on the concrete. He saw the red marks on Elena's wrists and the terror in her eyes. He remembered the bruise on Lisa's cheek. Every step he took was a promise. "I said stop," Marcus yelled, his finger tightening on the trigger. King didn't give him the chance to finish his thought. He didn't wait for a speech or a moment of drama. With a movement so fast, it was almost a blur, King drew his weapon. Marcus tried to raise his arm, but he was too slow. The logic King had used his whole life was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp need to protect his home. 2 shots rang out, loud as cannons in the small room. Marcus slumped to the floor without a sound, his plans for power and territory vanishing instantly. King didn't look at the body. He didn't gloat over his victory. He walked straight to Elena and began cutting the ropes with the same jagged knife Marcus had used to send his message. "Is Lisa safe?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling as the ropes fell away. "She's waiting for you," King said. His voice was finally quiet, the roar of the monster fading away. He helped her up, shielding her from the sight of Marcus on the ground. The price of blood had been paid in full. The war was over, not because of a deal or a contract, but because King had finally decided what was truly worth fighting for. He led her out of the dark basement and back into the rain, heading toward the only home he had left. The storm had finally passed, leaving the city quiet and shimmering under the pale light of a new morning. The mansion was no longer a fortress of cold stone and secrets. It felt different now, as if the air itself had been cleared by the rain. King stood by the window of his study, watching his men repair the damage to the front gates. They moved quietly, respectful of the silence that had settled over the house. King had secured his kingdom, but for the first time, the king didn't care about his throne. He walked down the long hallway toward Lisa's room, his footsteps light on the carpet. He had showered and changed into a soft sweater, leaving the ruined black suit and the smell of gunpowder behind. When he pushed the door open, he saw Elena sitting in a chair by the window, watching the sunrise. She looked up and gave him a tired, knowing smile before quietly slipping out of the room to let him in. Lisa was tucked under a mountain of blankets, her small face framed by the white pillow. The bruise on her cheek was still there, a fading purple reminder of the night the world turned dark, but she was sleeping peacefully. King pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. He didn't look like the man who had stormed a foundry or the boss who ruled the docks with an iron fist. He looked like a man who had finally found where he belonged. As the sun began to warm the room, Lisa stirred and opened her eyes. She didn't flinch this time. She didn't see a monster or a shadow. She saw the man who had come back for her, just like he promised. Slowly, she reached her small hand out from under the covers. King didn't hesitate. He reached out and took her hand, his large, scarred fingers gently closing around hers. "You're home," she whispered, her voice tiny and sweet. "I'm home," King replied, and he realized he meant it. He stayed there for a long time, holding her hand and watching her breathe. He had spent his whole life thinking that being a leader meant being alone and untouchable. He thought that having employees was safer than having family, because family could be hurt. But holding Lisa's hand, he understood that the love he felt for her wasn't a weakness. It was the greatest strength he had ever known. In that quiet room, the Mafia boss disappeared completely. He wasn't a king, and they weren't his staff. They were his heart. He made a silent promise to the sleeping girl. The world might still be a dangerous place, but as long as he was standing, she would never have to face the rain alone again. They were a family now, bound not by blood, but by a bond that had been forged in the fire and proven in the storm. This story teaches us that true strength is not found in the weapons we carry or the fear we inspire in others. Instead, it is found in the courage to be vulnerable and the willingness to protect what is innocent. Don't forget to like and subscribe.